I never imagined the hardest thing I'd ever come home to wouldn't be a fire, a break-in, or some medical emergency. It would be an empty patch of dirt where my father's tree had stood for more than half a century. The people responsible didn't sneak around in the middle of the night either. They showed up in broad daylight with chainsaws, paperwork they thought made them untouchable, and enough confidence to believe nobody would ever question them. They were wrong, because they didn't just cut down a tree. They cut through the last living memory I still had of my dad. And once they crossed that line, I stopped being the quiet neighbor everyone overlooked. My name is Ethan Walker, and until all of this happened, I lived a pretty ordinary life in a neighborhood called Willow Creek Ridge, one of those picture-perfect suburban developments where every mailbox matched, every lawn looked like it had been measured with a ruler, and the homeowners association acted like they were running a small country instead of a subdivision. I'd been there almost 12 years, kept my property clean, waved to neighbors, paid every HOA fee on time, and honestly tried to stay out of everybody else's business. If someone wanted to argue about fence colors or garbage cans sitting out an extra hour, that was never going to be me. I had enough going on with work, and when I was home, all I really wanted was a quiet cup of coffee on my porch while looking at the one thing that made that house feel like home. A 60-year-old sugar maple planted by my father when I was still a little kid. He planted it this summer after my parents bought the property, back when the entire neighborhood was nothing but open fields and fresh concrete. I can still remember standing beside him with a tiny plastic shovel, pretending I was helping while he laughed and told me that one day I'd be grateful for the shade. Turns out he wasn't talking about the weather. Every fall that maple exploded into deep orange and gold, and people actually slowed their cars just to admire it. Kids collected leaves under it. Photographers asked if they could take engagement pictures nearby, and every Thanksgiving I'd sit outside for a few minutes before family arrives, just staring at it because somehow it still made me feel like Dad hadn't completely left. He passed away from cancer almost 15 years ago, but that tree still carried his fingerprints in my mind. The HOA president, however, saw something different. Her name was Carol Preston, and if you've ever lived under one of those people who mistake authority for importance, then you already know exactly who she was. Carol loved rules the way some people love grandchildren. She once mailed me a violation notice because my garden hose was visible from the sidewalk after I'd watered my flowers. Another time she measured my lawn with an actual tape measure because she claimed the grass exceeded community standards by half an inch. Most of us laughed about it over neighborhood cookouts, but nobody ever challenged her because arguing with Carol usually meant months of letters, fines, and meetings nobody wanted to attend. Looking back now, maybe that was exactly why she became so bold. The week everything changed, I flew to Denver for a 3-day construction conference. It was boring, full of presentations, cheap hotel coffee, and people pretending networking was enjoyable. By the time I drove back into Willow Creek Ridge late Friday morning, all I could think about was sleeping in my own bed. Then I turned onto my street, and something felt wrong before I even parked. There was a strange emptiness in front of my house that my brain couldn't process at first. I stepped out of the truck and immediately smelled fresh sawdust mixed with gasoline. My stomach tightened. The grass across my front yard was scarred with deep tire tracks. Orange safety cones were scattered near the curb, and where my father's maple should have been, there was nothing but a raw stump surrounded by wood chips. I honestly don't remember walking across the yard. One second, I was standing by my truck. The next, I was kneeling beside that stump, with both hands resting on the rough wood, trying to understand how something so enormous could simply disappear. There were fresh rings exposed inside the trunk. 60 years of growth sliced apart in less than an hour. I kept waiting for someone to come running over and explain it was all some misunderstanding, maybe storm damage or an emergency utility repair. But the street stayed quiet. Mrs. Delgado from across the road finally stepped onto her porch, looked at me with genuine sympathy, and quietly said, "Ethan, I tried calling you. They said the HOA approved it." That sentence hit harder than anything else. Approved it? Approve destroying something that didn't belong to them? 2 days later, the answer arrived in my mailbox inside an official HOA envelope. According to the letter, my maple had allegedly become a public safety hazard because its roots might eventually interfere with a nearby sidewalk, and under Article 11 of the Community Guidelines, the board had authorized immediate removal in the interest of neighborhood safety. The last line thanked me for my cooperation. While I wasn't even in the state, I called Carol before I even finished reading the page. She answered on the second ring, sounding almost cheerful. "Ethan, I figured you'd have questions. I asked one simple thing. Who gave you permission to cut down my father's tree?" She sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Sometimes leadership requires difficult decisions. You should appreciate that we protected the neighborhood from future liability." I looked out my front window at the empty yard and quietly replied, "Carol, I think you just made the biggest mistake of your life." She laughed, an actual laugh, and said, "We'll see about that," before hanging up. Sitting there in complete silence, staring at the stump where my father once stood beside me holding a shovel all those years ago, I realized something. Grief can make people do reckless things, but it can also make them incredibly patient. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to threaten anybody. I was going to find out exactly what they'd done, and whether they had any legal right to do it at all. The next morning, I started with the simplest question I could think of. Who actually had the authority to remove a mature tree from private property? It sounded straightforward, but the deeper I dug, the stranger everything became. I took the HOA letter, poured myself a cup of coffee that went cold long before I remembered to drink it, and opened my laptop. Community bylaws led to county ordinances. County ordinances led to municipal environmental regulations. And before lunch, my dining room table looked like a lawyer's office, covered in printed maps, highlighted documents, and sticky notes. At first, nothing jumped out at me. Then one sentence buried inside the city's urban forestry code stopped me cold. Any designated legacy tree exceeding 50 years of documented age required written approval from the Department of Environmental Resources before removal, regardless of private ownership or HOA regulations. I read it again, then a third time. My heart started beating faster. Dad had planted that maple in 1965. I still had the faded family photo of him standing beside it, shovel in one hand and me sitting on his shoulders. If that tree had ever been registered, Carol hadn't just ignored a neighborhood rule. She'd ignored city law. I drove straight to the county archives that afternoon. The woman behind the records counter couldn't have been older than 30, but she knew exactly where to search. About 15 minutes later, she smiled, turned her monitor toward me, and said, "Well, this is interesting." There it was. Legacy Tree Registration Number, LTT 3187. Species, sugar maple. Date registered October 1978. Original applicant, Thomas Walker, my father. Status, protected. I stared at the screen so long she finally asked if I was all right. I almost laughed because for the first time since coming home, I realized I wasn't crazy. Dad had protected that tree decades earlier, probably because he knew someday somebody would try to tell him what he could and couldn't do with his own property. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every document. The clerk leaned closer and quietly said, "If someone removed this tree without a city permit, they're going to have a serious problem." Those words stayed with me all the way home. I didn't call Carol. I didn't send angry emails. I wanted facts, not arguments. Over the next 3 days, I became obsessive. I photographed every inch of my yard from every possible angle. I measured the stump. I documented the tire tracks that were still visible after a light rain. Mrs. Delgado handed me security camera footage showing the tree company arriving at 8:23 Tuesday morning. Another neighbor, Greg Lawson, remembered seeing Carol standing outside directing workers while holding a clipboard. He hadn't thought much about it until he saw my face after I got home. She looked proud," Greg admitted, like she was finally fixing something she'd wanted gone for years. Suddenly, dozens of little interactions started replaying in my mind. Carol complaining every autumn about leaves blowing across the street. Carol saying my tree blocked the community entrance from certain angles. Carol joking during an HOA meeting that one oversized tree doesn't belong in a neighborhood designed for symmetry. Back then, everyone laughed because it sounded ridiculous. Now it didn't feel like a joke anymore. This wasn't about safety. It was personal. She'd been looking for an excuse. Armed with my documents, I visited the Department of Environmental Resources. The inspector assigned to my case introduced himself as Daniel Morris, a man probably in his 60s with weathered hands and mud permanently embedded around the seams of his boots. He listened without interrupting while I laid everything across his desk: the registration, the HOA letter, the photographs, the witness statements, the security footage. When he reached the city's database confirming no removal permit had ever been issued, he slowly leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin. "Mr. Walker," he finally said, "I've investigated illegal tree removals for 26 years. Contractors do this sometimes. Developers occasionally do it too. But I've never seen an HOA authorize cutting down a protected legacy tree without even asking the city." He closed the folder and looked me straight in the eye. "Let's go take a look." Watching Daniel walk around my front yard felt strangely reassuring. He measured the stump, examined the cut marks, checked the remaining root flare, then quietly shook his head. "Healthy tree," he muttered. "No disease. No structural failure." Whoever claimed this thing was dangerous either didn't know what they were talking about, or they were lying. Before leaving, he took over 50 photographs himself. As he packed his equipment into the truck, he said something that made me realize the situation had just become much bigger than I expected. "This isn't your investigation anymore." 5 days later, bright orange notices appeared on the doors of the Willow Creek Ridge Clubhouse. Everyone stopped to read them. Environmental enforcement action pending. Unauthorized removal of protected municipal tree. Potential civil penalties. Mandatory hearings scheduled. By dinner, the entire neighborhood was talking. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Some neighbors apologized for not questioning the removal sooner. Others admitted they'd assumed Carol had city approval. A few still defended the board, saying the HOA must have had good reasons. Funny how people love authority until authority gets caught breaking the law. Carol finally called me that evening. Her voice no longer sounded cheerful. "Ethan, perhaps we've had a misunderstanding." I smiled despite myself. "Really? Because the city seems to understand things pretty well." She cleared her throat. "I'm sure we can resolve this privately." "You mean before the hearing?" I asked. Silence. Then she quietly replied, "These things don't need to become public." I looked through my window toward the empty space where my maple had once stood. "Carol, they already are." She hung up without another word. A week later, the monthly HOA board meeting became the busiest anyone could remember. Usually 15 people showed up. That night, nearly every chair was filled, with neighbors lining the walls and whispering among themselves before the meeting even started. Carol entered wearing her usual confident smile, but I noticed she kept adjusting the stack of papers in front of her like her hands suddenly didn't know what to do. Halfway through the agenda, she addressed the tree. "Recent allegations regarding the board's maintenance decision have unfortunately attracted unnecessary attention," she announced. "However, our legal authority under community safety provisions remains intact." I almost admired the confidence. Almost. When she finished, I quietly stood, walked to the front of the room, and placed a thick folder on the conference table. Nobody spoke. I opened it one page at a time. Certified Legacy Tree Registration. Municipal Code. Environmental Inspection Report. Security Footage Stills. Witness Affidavits. Finally, on top, the official enforcement notice signed by the city. Carol's smile disappeared before she'd even finished reading the first paragraph. One board member leaned toward her and whispered, "You told us permits had already been approved." Another stared at the documents and asked, "Carol, were they?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a glass of water, but her hand shook enough for everyone to notice. "We believed we had sufficient authority under HOA bylaws." Daniel Morris happened to be standing quietly in the back of the room. He stepped forward only after someone asked whether the city intended to pursue the case. His answer lasted less than 15 seconds. "Community bylaws," he said calmly, "do not override municipal environmental law." You could almost hear the air leave the room. Nobody argued after that. Nobody could. Over the following month, the consequences arrived one after another. The city imposed a $24,000 environmental penalty against the HOA. They were ordered to finance a complete restoration plan prepared by certified arborists, including premium soil replacement, irrigation improvements, long-term maintenance monitoring, and the installation of a new legacy-grade sugar maple already more than 10 feet tall so the neighborhood wouldn't lose decades of canopy coverage. The restoration alone cost thousands more. Insurance refused to cover most of it because the violation resulted from unauthorized board action. Then came the part Carol never saw coming. During the association's emergency election, homeowners voted to remove every board member who had signed the authorization. Some resigned before the vote even finished. Others tried blaming Carol, claiming they'd trusted her legal advice. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. But signatures have a funny way of surviving after excuses disappear. The day Carol carried the last box out of the clubhouse, she happened to look across the street and saw me watering the newly planted maple. We made eye contact for only a second. She looked like she wanted to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe another excuse. Instead, she simply got into her car and drove away, leaving behind the same silence she created the day my father's tree disappeared. And as I stood there watching those fresh green leaves move in the summer breeze, I realized the story still wasn't completely over. There was one final conversation that changed everything I thought I knew about justice. And it happened beside that young maple just a few weeks later, standing there with the hose in my hand, watching water soak into the fresh soil around that young maple. I finally understood something my father used to tell me when I was a kid. He'd say, "Son, winning isn't about making the other guy lose. It's about making sure what's right is still standing when the dust settles." Back then, I thought he was talking about baseball or fixing old engines in the garage. Turns out, he was talking about life. A few weeks after the board was removed, Daniel Morris stopped by my house on his way back from another inspection across town. He leaned against the fence, looked at the new tree, and smiled. "It'll take years before this one looks anything like the old maple," he said. I nodded. "I know." We stood there quietly for a minute before he added something that stuck with me. "People think laws like these exist to protect trees. They don't. They exist to protect people from believing power gives them permission." I thought about that long after he drove away. The truth was, I never really wanted revenge. If someone had asked me the day before I left for that business trip what I wanted most, I would have said another 20 years sitting beneath my dad's tree with a cup of coffee on Saturday mornings. No lawsuit, no investigation, no headlines around the neighborhood. No board members carrying cardboard boxes out of the clubhouse. Just my tree. But once that choice was taken away from me, I realized the only thing left worth protecting was the principle behind it. Over the following months, Willow Creek Ridge slowly changed. The new board actually listened to homeowners. Meetings became conversations instead of lectures. Rules were rewritten so major decisions involving private property required direct homeowner notification and documented city approval whenever local regulations applied. Neighbors who barely knew each other before started talking again. Mrs. Delgado still waved every morning from across the street. Greg joked that my front yard had become the most legally protected patch of grass in the county. For the first time in years, people laughed during HOA meetings instead of sitting there afraid to raise a hand. As for Carol, I heard she sold her house the following spring. Some neighbors said she was embarrassed. Others claimed she blamed everyone except herself. Honestly, I never tried to find out which version was true. Carrying resentment any longer would have given her more space in my life than she deserved. One cool October afternoon, almost a year after everything happened, I raked a handful of bright orange leaves that had fallen from the new maple. There weren't many, nothing compared to the mountain of leaves the old tree used to drop. But as I picked one up, I couldn't help smiling. Life has a strange way of reminding you that healing doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it starts with something as small as a single leaf. I looked toward the empty space where my father and I had once stood with that little plastic shovel all those decades ago. And for the first time since the chainsaws came, I didn't picture the stump anymore. I pictured him laughing. Maybe that's what justice is supposed to do. Not erase what happened, because nothing ever will. But make enough room for something better to grow in its place. Even now, though, I still think about one question. If I hadn't kept those old family photographs, if my father had never registered that maple all those years ago, if I had simply accepted the HOA's letter and moved on, would anyone have ever admitted they were wrong? Or would they have done the exact same thing to another homeowner a few months later? That's the part I still can't answer. Maybe some people only respect limits after someone finally forces them to face one. Maybe communities stay healthy only when ordinary people are willing to stand up, even when they're standing alone. I'd really like to hear what you think. If an HOA honestly believes it's protecting the neighborhood, does that ever justify making decisions about someone else's property without their knowledge? Or the moment they crossed onto private land with chainsaws, had they already crossed a line that could never be defended? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments because I read as many of them as I can, and these conversations are often just as interesting as the stories themselves. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, difficult neighbors, or someone who thought authority meant ownership, share your experience too. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next real-life inspired story. Trust me, sometimes the quietest neighborhoods hide the loudest battles.